Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. Today's featured bag is a children literature themed bag. I think I got it from Puffin. There's a little Puffin on there somewhere, and that's appropriate because today I'll be interviewing one of my very favourite contemporary children's authors. It's Philip Womack, whose work I've enjoyed for a long, long time. His books are elegant and erudite, a lot of fun, a little bit spooky, a lot spooky actually, and it's really wonderful to have him join me in the book bag. So welcome, Philip Womack.
Hi, Suzi, I'm blushing.
Well, that's a good start.
Lovely introduction. Thank you so much.
Bring out the roses in your cheeks, Philip. So I saw something on Twitter that you said something rather intriguing, that you've finished something. And that sounded exciting. What was that? Can you tell us?
Well, I haven't finished it. I've come up with something.
Come up with an ending.
Come up with an ending for a book which may never come to light is really what's happened. Because I've come to the end of my contract with Little Island. I did 2 books for them, Wildlord, which you can see behind me, and Ghostlord, which is coming out in May the 4th, which is a exciting ghost themed narrative where a girl finds a magic mirror in her garden and there's a ghost in it, and it sort of turns out that maybe he's not quite who he says he is, essentially speaking. But so I thought I'd try my hand at something for younger children, which I've never really done before. And so I've just sort of come up with something for that, and then we'll see what happens with it.
And is it a continuation of the sort of story of Wildlord? Because I remember there's a fantastic house with all sorts of mysterious dimensions and portals, and a rather engaging young hero. So is he going to come back? He was Tom Swinton, wasn't he?
That's right.
Last of the Swintons.
Last of the Swintons. Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, I'm sure you know how publishing works, and particularly how YA works, and there's not always an appetite for a direct sequel to something because of the way that the mechanics of the publishing world work. So what Ghostlord is it's in the same world. So in Wildlord, there's a magical race of people who are very much like the Sidhe, the Irish Sidhe, except in my version they're called the Sandia, which means the holding together. They're a sort of supernatural race of people who essentially watch over the world and make sure it doesn't sort of get torn apart by evil magicians and other people who cause trouble. So they're there very much. And then also, because what happens to Tom is that he discovers that he's got this power within himself, and then he learns how to use it throughout the course of the novel. And he also comes to terms with his own family tragedy, which is that both his parents died in an accident at sea. And a similar sort of thing is happening in Ghostlord, where the heroine, Meg, she's sort of same sort of age. She's just on the cusp of adulthood, which I think is such an interesting period where you're kind of assessing who you are, where you fit in with the world, how you fit in with your family, and your kind of sense of yourself. And she is thrown into a new situation which she doesn't want. Her mother moves her out of London, and she absolutely hates it. They move into this little cottage, which is haunted. And then
of course.
she discovers she's got this extraordinary power, which is that she can basically punch holes through space. She can access a kind of network of tunnels that can move her anywhere in the world at any one time. And so she has to kind of deal with that power at the same time as dealing with this ghost, and with her father, who had a nervous breakdown and is in hospital, and with her mother, who's working very hard and not really there all the time. So it's a continuation of the same kind of themes, and there is a character who recurs, but I won't tell you who it is because it's a big surprise.
Fantastic. Well, you mentioned the Sidhe, and one thing I've really loved about your writing for children is that you use a lot of mythology and draw on your own, no doubt, wide reading, certainly in the classics. So is there a little bit of this also in the new one, or Are we going a bit Jonathan Stroud here?
No, it's really so. So in Wildlord, so one of the things about Wildlord is that the main the sort of main antagonist is called James Swinton, and he is a magus. He's a kind of Jonathan D figure, and I've always been interested in that boundary between knowledge and when does knowledge become too much, and when do you delve too far into things and it becomes dangerous. And so that sort of idea is still there. There's an obsidian mirror in Ghost Lord, which is obviously John Dee had an obsidian mirror, and there's in Wildlord, obviously the framework that Jack Swinton has is a classical framework, so he refers to various classical things. And in Ghost Lord, actually, weirdly enough, just here, the Trojan horse is very much an important symbol, and it kind of feeds throughout the text. So that there's very much a sense of classical mythology being there in the background in terms of how it informs stories and how it makes how it deepens everything, basically, because you can't escape it, especially if you're writing about people in the 16th century or onwards, or at any period, really. You can't escape classical literature, which is why I think it's so important. Just to get on my soapbox for a minute.
Yes. as a teacher of Latin, a great enthusiast for the classics, a Latinist. I mean, that's what I've always loved about your books, is that they have a kind of educational factor which doesn't get in the way of the plot or the excitement. But they're also, you learn interesting things. They're full of interesting ideas and concepts, a lot of which you've taken from these classic texts. So to look at another Twitter comment you made, you were looking for a copy of Puck of Pook's Hill, which seemed kind of an unusual thing to look for today, perhaps. What was that about?
Well, it's interesting. Well, because I loved it as a child, and I think I was about 9 or 10 when I read it, and I remember it so vividly, extraordinarily vividly, particularly. I mean, I grew up in Sussex, and obviously it's set in Sussex, although I was West Sussex, and it's very much in East Sussex. But even
it's Kipling, isn't it? And he lived at Bateman's, right. So I think it's meant to be set round there, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And I, sort of just have such vivid impressions of, I don't know if you remember it, but Dan and Una, the two children, and they meet a Roman soldier. They meet an old god, Wayland the Smith, and all sorts of other people. And I started reading it. In fact, my son, who's 7, picked it off the shelf, and my copy is falling apart. And so I wanted to get another version of it to give to all my children. But also, I think it's a book that needs to survive. I think reading it, I was really, really struck by the humanity that runs through it, particularly in the beginning. I mean, his history is all wrong. Like, I'm like, none of the Roman Britain stuff is complete. I mean, even I, with my limited knowledge of Roman Britain, know that what he is saying is mostly wrong. But the humanity is lovely, and particularly in the section where there's a young novice I think he's called Hugh, who's a Saxon, and then there's a Norman, and they become friends, and and they really do genuinely want to make things better for people, and they want the Saxon Norman thing to work, and I think that's a nice, important message to have. And I think it's something also that maybe people forget existed, that there were these sentiments that people didn't just want everything to be one-sided, that there was a real sense that things could be integrated and could work really well. And particularly in the Roman section, where the young Roman I don't know what they are, whether they're centurions or captains or whatever, but they go out and they become friends with the Picts, and they develop a relationship with the Picts, and it's very nice. It's a mutual thing. It's not like we're conquering you. It's a kind of it's a symbiotic thing.
And what else were you reading when you were a little one? Well, I imagine you as being very precocious and just reading really early. And
yeah, I'm afraid I was incredibly maybe ridiculously precocious. And so I read, like many readers and writers, I read all the children's books that were on the shelves to all the classics. And I think it's important to remember in some sense that there wasn't the wealth of contemporary fiction for children when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s that there is now. I mean, I remember everything was very much, it was Puffin Classics, Red Fox. So we had Brian Jacks, I don't know how you say it, Brian Jacks or Brian Jakes.
Puffin.
Puffin.
Yeah.
And but the Puffin Classics and things like T.H. White, Rudyard Kipling, Lewis Carroll, all of those things, they just really, and I've always found it astonishing that things, E. Nesbit, I mean, E. Nesbit is extraordinary. They were written in the turn of the last century or the century before last, even 1903, and they're still as fresh and vivid now as they were when she wrote them. And I think it says a lot about children's fiction and how important it is that they kind of are all, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say that they're timeless, but they kind of exist almost without temporal limits because of the language that they're written in, and the things that they deal with are things that any child, within a certain kind of set of parameters can access and enjoy. So yeah, I was reading all the classics, particularly fond of T.H. White, which I just adored. I mean, and again, there's a question: is are those really children's books? They're very, very adult. They have very adult themes. They have adult characters. It's only in the first book that you have Wart, which is that lovely way of dealing with King Arthur and giving him that sort of empathetic name, and he has all these wonderful adventures. But really, it deals with the matter of Britain, and it deals with the tragedy. The death of Arthur is a very, very adult tragedy, but dealt with in a way that, as I was an 11-year-old, I think, when I read it, and I just adored it. I just couldn't put it down.
Did you read the whole thing? Because The Sword in the Stone is often hived off, isn't it? Yeah. But things get very serious as soon as you're out of The Sword in the Stone. Were you reading the whole thing?
The whole thing, all four of them. The Queen of Air and Darkness, The Candle. I think it's called The Candle in the Wind. I forget what they're called now, but yeah, I had the one volume, Once and Future King, and I was obsessed with King Arthur. And what was amazing, and what what's always driven me as a reader is finding connections between things. So I remember reading that, and then I read Tennyson, the Idylls of the King, and then I read the Morte d'Arthur. So it kind of sparks things off in various directions, and I became kind of obsessed with Grail stories, and Parsifal, I think I read or tried to read when I was 12, and all that sort of thing. The Fairy Queen I got as a birthday present when I was, I think, 13, and I read that. A gentle knight was pricking through the plains.
I mean, I loved it, but as an undergraduate, when I read it, it's quite hard going, isn't it? I think we only did the first 3 books.
Dragons and Error. The first bit, there's a knight, and I remember it, so vividly. And there's a knight, Red Cross, and Una with her, with her lamb, and then they go and they kill Error, and Error's kind of this monstrous thing. It's so vivid, So I loved all that. Yeah, and I just read very indiscriminately all throughout my adolescence and childhood and adolescence, and right up until university, which is, I think, why I was drawn to doing classics and English, because I didn't. I wanted to kind of read as widely as possible.
And did you do a sort of old-fashioned course, as it were? I mean, as I did, we kind of marched through the centuries in a way that I think would seem very fusty-dusty and old-fashioned now, but actually was incredibly useful because I know all my periods. It became very useful when I was a literary editor. I knew where everything was in time. What was your course like?
It was so because it was a specially designed course. So you did linked papers. So epic, tragedy, comedy, you could choose from a mixture, and those were extraordinary because in the epic paper, which we did do chronologically, you went from Homer down to Ulysses. And I just remember, again, and looking back on it, you think, God, I was allowed to read those things. Mm-hmm. And it's such a joy and a privilege to be able to do those things, and I wish sometimes that I had gone into academia, but that's another question. But yeah, the course was designed first to highlight the links between classics and English. So in my first year, we did Elizabethan things. So Philip Sidney, Spencer, Thomas Brown, all that sort of thing. And then it was kind of a mixture of the two. So you could pick and mix. But the English course at Oxford was straight down the line. It was from Anglo-Saxon to the modern age. So there was definitely a sense of chronology, and that particularly worked in the sense of linking the two together. And you have to look at things chronologically then, because you're looking at influence and how everything fits together.
Mm. Yeah, so Philip Sidney is kind of my literary dreamboat, and I remember.
There he is.
There he is, right there. I remember reading Astrophil and Stella, and rereading it quite recently. Actually, it was something that I reread during lockdown, and they're definitely not just here's someone to read before Shakespeare comes along. I think he's often seen just as a precursor, but I think they're absolutely amazing. And everybody who, paved the way for Shakespeare, everybody who put one stone in place is really worthy of reading, but not just for that reason.
I completely agree, and I'm a big fan of. I think Virginia Woolf called it something like the most unread book in English literature, which is the Arcadia. And the one that I like is not the old Arcadia. I like the new one where it goes all epic and weird, and he sort of doesn't finish it because I think he died, as you know, very very young. But I find there's something so extraordinary about that book. It's so artificial, but at the same time so involving, and it's so complex. Like the plots, Parthenia and Argolis appear in book one, and then they disappear, and you think that plot's finished, but then they reappear, and it's sort of extraordinary. And I always wonder how on earth he did it. Like how did he retain all that information in his mind? Did he write it down? Without anything, without computers, without anything.
No post-it notes, no whiteboards. How did these people manage it? It's ridiculous.
A whole load of page boys kind of holding the pages up. It's kind of.
They didn't have any, AI chat to help them with this stuff.
Elizabethan chatbot.
That would be quite a fun idea. Well, you mentioned just earlier on E. Nesbit, who I also really adored. And one of the things I remember when I read Nesbit was just like words that are not around anymore, or expressions. It really expanded your vocabulary. And I sometimes wonder, and you've reviewed a lot of children's literature, and I sometimes wonder if there's a trend, not so much to make things too easy, but to make things reflect the child's experience, make things relevant. And everything we've talked about has almost been completely irrelevant. Do you know what I mean? Like the Arcadia, the sonnets of Philip Sidney. I mean, I would argue that they're deeply relevant.
Oh, God, yes.
You can imagine a publisher going, why would anybody,
Yeah, but you see, I find this notion of relevance very, very strange, because, well, first of all, I would argue that part of the reason for reading a book is that it doesn't reflect you or your experience at all. And certainly the things that I remember reading a book about apartheid in South Africa when I was about 12, which, it was probably, I think it was one of those Windbill. I don't know if you remember with the Windbill books, they did kind of teen fiction at the time. And I remember really finding it interesting, despite the fact that it had no relevance to me as a little boy in a prep school in Sussex. But the themes and the language and everything was extraordinary. And the same goes not just for place, but for time as well. And Puck of Picks Hill works so well because it draws you into a different time. I think it's very, very limiting to say, well, okay, yes, a book has to only reflect what that child knows, partly because then the child never sees anything else, but also because all children's experiences are different. And, one child's experience in a flat in London is going to be vastly different from someone living in a croft in Scotland. So you can't sort of, say, okay, well, this is or isn't relevant, because there's no matrix, there's no metric for saying, well, this is relevant and this isn't. And I particularly find that with vocab, actually. And so there are some So when you read, in fact, it's interesting reading Rudyard Kipling. He just got, all of it is in slang, the slang of the time. So the bits with Dan and Una, they use their own slang. Sometimes Dan explains it to the Romans, which is quite funny. And then, but they generally speak in a kind of cod, historical way, using the vocab of the time. And even when he's describing the landscape of Sussex, like oast houses and things, these are things that mean nothing. Even I don't really even know what an oast house is, but I can find out, and so can my son. And that's the point. Like you don't find out about things unless you see them. So, I remember Geraldine McCaughrean saying something along the lines of, children should be bathed in words. You should shower them in vocabulary, and I agree. And I think children are really good at learning by kind of sensing, a word in between two other words. They'll know the sense of it, and then eventually they'll work out the actual meaning of it. And when you work out the specific meaning of it, then you have power. Because the knowing those words gives you power, and obviously the range of experience and vocab that you have is the more you have, the better. So I'm all for challenging, well, not even challenging children, but just like using the full gamut. I mean, Joan Aiken, The Wolves of Willoughby Chase, I read it to my son quite recently, and she uses this word. The vocab is extraordinary. In the first page, she uses this word goffering. There's a maid goffering a skirt, and I didn't know what goffering meant.
Is this something to do with an iron or putting pleats in or something like that?
I think what it is putting the pleats in, yeah. But I looked it up afterwards. I read it to Arthur, and I didn't ask him about it. He didn't mention it, but I'm sure that he had the image of a maid with a dress, and you just kind of. So that's another word added to your word hoard, which I think is it's fantastic. And also, I don't remember as a child reading it myself, stopping on that word and going, "Oh, I'm not going to read this book now because it's got a word I don't understand in it." Because that's not how you read. You don't read like word by word. You read sentence by sentence, and you get led on to the next one. And if you don't necessarily grasp the exact meaning of something, it doesn't necessarily matter.
I was always asking my mum, I'd stop at a word and go, "Mum, what's this? What's that?" And then she'd do it about 5 times and then go, "Stop asking me." But that was quite good, because it like you say, you're figuring it out for yourself. It's probably more valuable to do that. And then the word comes up again and you kind of remember the context. And then, that's sort of how kids learn right to begin with, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And adults as well, and even occasionally you come across something you don't quite grasp, and then you look it up, and then you've got it,
Yeah.
So yeah,
do you use your kids as a kind of little at-home laboratory for ideas and works, and do you read your own works to them?
Yeah, I will when they're a bit older. They're a little bit too young at the moment. I'm going to try this younger one on the older one. But yeah, it's quite. But then the thing is, they'll only ever going to say, "Yes, Daddy, please carry on reading it," because that's just, they don't
what
have
extraordinarily polite children you have. I hear stories all the time of authors whose children go, "Oh, shut up, don't read any, I don't want to read your books, Mum."
Well, maybe that will come to pass when I've put too many in their way. So yeah, but it's something that I will do when Arthur's a bit older.
Yeah, and so the big story around at the moment that broke a little while ago was the editing, censorship, bowdlerising. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. Of Roald Dahl, a beloved children's author, and boy, did people get angry about that. You had the two sides. Let me tell you how publishing works side, and then how dare they touch the works of Roald Dahl. I'm sure you had a view on this and watched this with some interest.
I did watch it with a lot of interest, and I think that there's a lot of things going on. I think that we're going through a very strange phase. I mean, perhaps it's never really gone away, but there's always been a slightly puritanical view that what children read has to be completely sanitized, as if there was a direct link between reading something that is seen as suspect and then the child then going on and doing something, which is not, in my view, the case. And I think that so that's one thing, is that there is this kind of sense that somehow publishers have a moral duty towards children, but my issue with that is that it's so arbitrary, because Roald Dahl's books have been around for decades, and it's not as if there's been a massive rise in one thing or another, because a child doesn't read George's Marvelous Medicine and then go and kill his grandmother. That's not how things work, but my other issue with it, well, I have quite a few issues with it, and not all kind of, but anyway, I'll try and get them in some sort of order. But so one of my issues with it is that I remember that when I was little and reading Enid Blyton, and I think that they changed, I can't remember which series it was, but it might have been The Naughtiest Girl, or it might have been something else. And they modified the series as I was reading them. And when I started reading them, they had shillings. The children used shillings. And obviously I knew what a shilling was, because children are able to understand that the shilling is something that is money. It's not like you'll be like, oh, what's a shilling? And and then they changed it to a 10p piece. And that, to me, was really weird, partly because nothing else had been changed. So only this new egregious modern thing had been put in place, but also because the value of a 10p, even as I was little, was shrinking. So whereas a shilling always was a shilling and would only ever be something that could buy whatever a shilling could buy in that book, which is a time capsule, the 10p is going to shift, and it won't be able to buy an India rubber ball or whatever they were going to buy with it, because of inflation. So and I sensed that even as a child, that it was wrong. And it's so arbitrary. So with the Enid Blyton books, with The Faraway Tree, they changed Dick and Fanny's names to Rick and Franny. So Dick and Fanny, again, in England, have got these connotations, but nobody minded for decades that Dick and Fanny were called Dick and Fanny. So why suddenly change it now so prudishly?
There's also Titty. Yeah. Titty in Swallows and Hammers.
Exactly. They didn't change Aunt Fanny's name in the Famous Five. So if you read the Famous Five, you still get Aunt Fanny. So you think, well, what's the, there's no logical reasoning here. I mean, the Frances Fanny thing is extraordinary. As a side note, Fanny Burney, who throughout her entire life was known as Fanny Burney, is now called Frances Burney. Her name has been altered. If she was around now, she'd say, why are you calling me Frances? It's so weird.
There was also Mary Wollstonecraft's great friend was called Fanny Blood.
Yeah, well,
it was just
And
anyway, what a strange byway we've gone down. But I do take your point.
And so to go back to the Dahl, so I think that a book, okay, and I'm not saying that a book is sacrosanct, because obviously books can and should be edited and are edited, and he edited them during his lifetime and all that sort of thing. But it is a time capsule, and if you start tinkering with with the material, it's like a tapestry. That's a better way of looking at it. It's a tapestry, and if you start pulling away at some of the threads, then it starts looking a bit weird, and then you end up with a patchwork. And I think that if we take the position that those books are somehow malignant, which they clearly are not, there's no causal connection between reading Roald Dahl books and being a horrible person. In fact, quite possibly it might be the opposite, because you're sort of taught, good and evil. They're very, very strong on what's good and what's evil. But if you start doing that, then you end up with something that's completely different. So what you should rather do is let people find their own books, and it's very strange that, I mean, it's great that I think it's great that sort of E. Nesbit's still around, and I think it's important that these books should still be around on the shelves as classics, and they will be. But what's weird is that Dahl is still a bestseller even now. And Charlie and the Chocolate Factory came out in 1960, and that is quite strange because, and it has got something to do with the fact that language hasn't changed very much over the time, so those books are still as accessible now as they were then. So I sort of slightly feel that they should be left as they are, and then parents will read them, teachers will read them. If they don't read them, it doesn't matter, but they're still good books, and people should be able to read them as they are.
One of the things I think about children and reading, and thinking back to my own reading as a child, was the extent to which I entered the books myself. So, joined the famous five, thought seriously at one point about running away to the circus, or how nice it would be to own a python. And I think in a way that I kind of reimagined the books even as I was reading them. So the stuff that sort of didn't interest me, or just didn't bother me, I was kind of in this world, having an adventure, and I didn't need to take it too literally. And it's quite a while ago, but I read the entire Famous Five sequence for a piece that I was writing. So one thing is hilarious is that they never age. They have
they're like,
they have 15 successive summer holidays.
Yeah. I remember working that out as a child, that Julian would be about 21 by the end of it. Yeah.
And there was all this stuff, and there is some questionable stuff in Brighton, Blyton, but in Brighton as well, actually. But we're talking about Blyton. I'd sort of edited it out in my mind. So all the stuff about, have you seen those newcomers in the village? They look foreign. They're clearly up to no good. I don't think it particularly affected me. It was quite a surprise to read some of that stuff as an adult, and I realised it just went. Whew,
a lot of it goes straight over Charles' head, exactly. But and the thing about Blyton though is that she's quite often misrepresented. I mean, she wrote so much, and people quite often pick on one thing as if it was emblematic of her entire work. And but for instance, the first Famous Five, it's Anne who rescues George and Julian, and Anne and Dick. And I think Anne in the series she gets less active as the series goes on, but that's probably just because she ran out of things to do with her. I mean, and the naughtiest girl is one of the accusations that's always leveled at Blyton, is that she's somehow a terrible snob and all that sort of thing. She's only interested in, but she's really not. And the naughtiest girl that is a radical school where the children set their own rules and kind of have their own system, and they have this kind of little parliament. And I remember thinking that was extraordinary as a child, and that all children should have their own parliaments. Of course, it's total nonsense because the children are children. But as a radical idea, it's extraordinary. It isn't like ossified and kind of class-based. And even we've been listening to Malory Towers, and they're very they're really sensible, but they're also really gripping. Like there's a sort of scene where Daphne, I don't know if you remember your Malory Towers, but Daphne is this sort of pretty, slightly kind of silly girl, makes a friendship with a rather mousy girl called Mary Lou, and Mary Lou goes off on the cliff path at night, and Daphne goes to find her and like rescues her, and it's an extraordinary scene. It's absolutely gripping. Like we were all completely gripped by this. So I really think that she's quite often taken to be a sort of emblem of something that's really wrong or sinister, but she really isn't. If you look at her work as a whole, there's a lot of goodness and there's a lot of kindness there.
And in Malory Towers, lying is bad, bullying is bad. And because it's a sort of girls' school, I mean, it's not overt. It's not like they're beating each other up. There's this sort of sense of the subtlety of girls' interaction, and when it can be hurtful, and when, and good old Daryl sort of clears the way. Yeah. But they are. I mean, she really nails it, I think. Yep. I loved all of those, I must say. But to move on to other slightly more challenging, shall we say, books. I mean, I absolutely loved the things that I was reading, with things like Tom's Midnight Garden Antonia Barber's The Ghost, which was made into The Amazing Mr. Blunden, wonderful film, and the great Alan Garner. He was probably my god. Were you? You must have encountered Garner's amazing fictional world at some point.
Yeah, I did. I actually very vividly remember reading Elidor and finding it, because I think I was just about 9 or 10, and finding it absolutely extraordinary and completely unlike anything that I'd ever read before, because it doesn't have a beginning and a middle and an end like any normal story does. It's very, it's almost like a poem, in the force of its language. And I still remember, I mean, I've obviously recently reread it, but I still remember the first time I read it, and that ending when the unicorn arrives, and it's so enigmatic and weird. Like what you don't know what's happened. It's an extraordinary thing. So yeah, I very much loved Alan Garner as an adolescent more than as a. I think he's quite difficult for kind of 9 to 12-year-olds to grasp on any bit, because he doesn't have that kind of the pat ending and all that sort of thing that you sort of need when you're that little. But certainly 12 plus. Yeah, I remember being very, very enchanted by what the Weirdstone of Brisingamen, which was very Tolkien-esque, and he was very much after Tolkien, and alongside Susan Cooper, I remember the Merlin books as well, and then the Owl Service, and what was the other one? Redshift. Yeah.
Well, Redshift, I mean, I don't think I understand that to this day, but you don't need to. Nobody does. Nobody does. And the Owl Service, I mean, it's got the ultimate ending where you're sort of, what just happened? What? But it's absolutely incredible, and I loved the Owl Service.
It's interesting talking about authors and cancellation and all that sort of thing, because there was an author who was properly cancelled, and rightly so. I mean, whether the rights or the wrongs of it, we don't possibly have time to debate it today. But William Mayne, who was
I loved his A Swarm in May. Just the atmosphere in that book is wonderful.
He was an extraordinary writer, and he was, as he was convicted of sexual abuse, and then I think he killed himself. I'm not sure, and then his books vanished. But the Hill, I forget what it's called now.
I'm afraid you just froze, so we might have to edit that a little bit. So his books vanished, and then you disappeared. So
they all vanished off the shelves. But I remember reading one of them, which was about a drummer boy who one day he's just walked through time, and then the sort of hero has to waken or maybe put back to sleep. I can't remember now. King Arthur, who's under a hill, and it's extraordinary book. So there's a lot of really, really, really good fiction around. We're very, very lucky. I think the sort of 50s and the 60s in particular were very, very fertile, perhaps because of the Second World War, and a reaction to that, a sense of kind of cosmic good and evil maybe coming into play. But I think now as well, we're very lucky, and there's an enormous landscape of writers who are interesting and unusual. Frances Harding, I think, brilliant. Sally Gardner, Catherine Rundle. There's so many.
I loved Leon Garfield as well.
Yes,
his historical novels are wonderful, and he writes a cracking ghost story too. Again, it's sort of the language that pulled me in. There's one of his called Smith, about a young kind of pickpocket urchin on the streets of London in the 18th century, and it's all tricorn hats and frock coats and things, but you just enter that world. I mean, he just does it so brilliantly, and Smith is one of the great children's characters in literature, I think. He wrote a lot of. Sorry.
No, go
on. He wrote a lot of books, and I haven't worked my way through all of them, but Smith is something that I read and reread and reread.
Yes, he's rather slipped off the radar, I think, now.
Yeah, we'll have to bring him back.
Yeah, a lot of those writers are. I mean, when I do school visits and mention, they always ask, what did you read? And then you have to think, what do I say?
Yeah.
And eventually I usually land on Ursula Le Guin, T.H. White, and Alan Garner, and they usually haven't heard of them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Usually teachers now as well, because the teachers are now coming, they're sort of in their 20s and 30s, and so they wouldn't have grown up necessarily with those writers. So yeah, there's definitely, I would be pleased to bring Wizard of Earthsea back into the light, and Once the Future King, and all those sorts of things.
I'll bring Smith back, and the Owl Service.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about Smith also, and we probably haven't got time to go into this either, is the illustrations were absolutely wonderful. I haven't got the name of the illustrator off the top of my head, but there was an exhibition at the British Library that had some of the work. I mean, there's an illustration in Smith of the man with a peg leg sitting on a gravestone that haunts me to this day, and I remember being terrified. And it's not a particularly scary image, and the scene isn't even that scary. It's quite odd. It's quite weird, but just the image frightened me so much, but in a good way. I didn't mind being frightened.
It's funny that, isn't it? How things that aren't necessarily frightening will stick with you, and then they remain with you in that sort of vivid, nightmarish way. But that I think, that's what children's fiction is really good at doing. It's so sort of it makes those impressions, those lasting impressions.
Yes. Well, Philip, thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And we'll have to have you back when your next book comes out, and we'll talk about that in more detail. So thank you for telling us all about your reading and your work. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much for joining us on the book bag. We don't want to keep you away from your reading, so back to your books. But if you'd like to hear more, do please subscribe. Thanks for listening this time.